Are you struggling to get your podcast listeners to do anything? Whether it's following you on social, telling a friend about your show, visiting your website, joining your Patreon, donating, joining your coaching program, buying your product, or even just listening to more episodes. These actions are crucial to the growth and success of your podcast business. And if you don't get your listeners to do these things or anything, your show is not going to grow, it's not going to generate any revenue, and your show will fade just like all of the hundreds of other podcasts that stopped. And if you don't get your listeners to do these things, your show is never going to grow and your revenue is never going to increase. And you'll just spend the rest of your life making this podcast that nobody hears and not making any money doing it. But if you get good at this, if you get good at getting your podcast listeners to do things that they want to do, you will become a successful podcaster way quicker than you ever dreamed. In this video, I'm going to teach you the 3 simple things that you need to make an effective, to make an irresistible call to action to your podcast listeners. You're going to learn how to make the perfect call to action, and you're going to learn when in the episode you should make that call to action. My name is Kevin. I've taken 2 podcasts past 6 figures in revenue in only 3 years, and in 2022, I will surpass the 7-figure podcaster mark. And I've been able to do this by building up 2 audiences, building tons of trust with that audience, and getting that audience to do things that not only they want to do, but also help my podcast grow and make more money. You can do the same thing, and in just a few minutes, you are going to learn how. So let's jump in. Let me ask you this. How many times have you said something like this on your podcast? If you like the show, be sure to subscribe and follow me on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, and be sure to join the Patreon page and visit our sponsors and let us know if you like anything. Rate and review and tell 5 friends that you like the show. Does that sound familiar? If you're like me, you've done this dozens of times. In fact, on my first podcast, Philly Who, that's kind of how I ended every episode, and it didn't work so well. And the reason why it doesn't work so well is because it is not a strong call to action. Let me ask you a second question. Have you ever made a call to action like this? Before we begin this episode, I want you to visit my website and check out the products and services that I can offer you. Have you ever done something like that? You're not alone. If you've done any sort of calls to action that sounded like either of those 2 things, the reason why your listeners didn't take you up on that action is because those are not good calls to action. And it's because you're not calling your listeners to action in the right way and at the right time. So what's the right way and what's the right time? Well, let's start with the simpler one, the right time to put a call to action in your podcast episode. The time to put a call to action in your podcast episode is not at the beginning of the episode. It's at the end. When someone presses play on your podcast episode, it's because something in the title of that episode was interesting to them and they want to hear about what that is. The title of your episode should make a promise, like how this CEO overcame being an orphan to build a billion-dollar company, or uncover the mystery behind this 1975 murder case, or something like that. When the listener sees that title and they click on the episode, they're like, ooh, that sounds good. I want to hear that. Now, if the first thing that they hear after they press play is you pitching them to go do something else, what do you think the odds are that they're going to stop what they're doing and go do that thing? How do you think that feels? They're like, what the heck? Who is this person? I came here to learn something or hear a story or whatever it is, and now they're pitching me on something else? I wish I never clicked on this. And then they never come back to your show ever again. They go listen to an episode of Joe Rogan or This American Life or something like that. Because by the way, you're competing with those shows, which can be done if you listen to me. So no, the first 2 minutes of your podcast episode is not the time to sell your listener on doing something else, like liking, subscribing, buying your product or service, or looking you up on social or anything, literally anything except listening to the episode. In fact, that's what you have to sell people on in the first 2 minutes of every podcast episode, to listen to the rest of the episode. The framework behind that is a topic for a video coming in the future, and comment below if you are interested in how to create an incredible podcast intro in only 2 minutes, and we'll let you know when the video is live. This episode is about calls to action. So if you actually want your listeners to do what you ask them to do and actually take the action that you call them to, here is what to do. You have to make the call to action at the end of the episode. Now, this means that your episode has to be good. Your intro, the first 2 minutes, has to sell them successfully on listening to the rest of the episode, and the body of the episode needs to be good so that they don't bail. So, like everything else, none of this is going to work if your podcast sucks. But if it doesn't, and people do actually listen to the whole episode, then once you are done delivering the content and you had made good on the promise that you made in the title of the episode and the first 2 minutes, that is the time to ask your listener for something else. After you have delivered the content of the podcast episode, you have delighted the listener, you've surprised them, you've made good on their investment of 45 minutes of their time with you, then you can ask them to do something else. And so that's when to make your call to action, but how do you make a good call to action? Well, even if you're somebody who is already making your calls to action at the end of the episode, there's a good chance you're still doing it wrong. And if you're still watching this video, that's probably why, because you're interested, right? Because it's not working. So let's fix that. There are 3 ingredients that you need for an irresistible call to action. If you are able to check these 3 boxes, you will be able to get your audience and your podcast listeners to do literally anything that you want them to do. So here they are, the 3 steps. Step number 1, the call to action must be one specific little step. One thing, just one thing. The more options you give somebody to do something, the more likely it is that they will do none of them. There's a famous study where researchers set up a free sample table in a grocery store. And on day 1, they put out 26 different samples or something like that. I'll put the link in the description. But it was like 25, 26 free samples of jam. What's interesting is on that day, they got tons of people to try the jam. But guess what? Nobody bought any. On day 2, they set up in the same grocery store and they offered only 6 free samples of jam. On day 2, when there were only 6 options, way more people bought the jam. So what's the moral of that story? The more options you give somebody, the more overwhelmed they get by choice and the more likely that they choose to do nothing. That is why you spend so much time in the spaghetti sauce aisle staring at 500 options, where if you go to Trader Joe's and there's one spaghetti sauce, you're more likely to buy spaghetti sauce than if you're staring at a wall of 25 spaghetti sauces for 20 minutes and then you're like, you know what, never mind, I don't want spaghetti, I'm out of here. That's how it works, right? You're doing the same thing to your podcast listeners when you give them 45 things to do at the end of a podcast episode. You're showing them a wall of 25 spaghetti sauces and they're like, you know what, I don't even like spaghetti. And they leave and they do nothing and then your show doesn't grow and it never gets monetized. And so you need to offer them one thing to do. They have to choose either to do it or to not do it. That's step number 1 of step 1. Step number 2 is to make sure that that thing that you offer them to do is a little next step in their relationship with you. Just a little, not something huge. So when you're dating somebody, right? First comes love, first comes marriage, first comes out in a baby carriage, you know? Maybe it doesn't go that way anymore, but you get the point. There's a step, there's a logical next step to everything. On the second date, you talk about the third date. You don't talk about marriage on the second date. Some of you might have and be married, good for you, but you get what I'm saying. If you're a podcaster and on a podcast episode, at the end of the episode, you pitch your coaching program, that's talking about marriage on the second date. That's too big of a step. Somebody is not going to go from listening to you for 45 minutes to buying your coaching program right then and there, unless you listen to Grow the Show, because my coaching program is that good. You get what I'm saying. So if you are calling to action something that is a big step, like a stranger who barely knows you is never going to do that thing, you're probably losing out on a bunch of great listener relationships. So instead, you want to call to action a small little next step that will further the relationship with you. That little next step should be cheap or better yet, free to take and should just be really easy to do, like to join a community like a Facebook group or a Discord, or maybe download a helpful PDF that relates to the episode that you just talked about, or something specific like share this with one friend or something like that. It should be easy. They can do it in like 2 minutes. It doesn't take a lot of thought, and it's the only option that they have. By the way, if your podcast is monetized with a Patreon or Supercast or some sort of membership, the end of the episode is a good time to actually call that to action. Joining that is totally a little thing that they can do in just a couple of steps. And if you really want to make it easier, I know that Supercast allows you to create a free trial where they don't even have to pay for the first month and you can get them in the door. So that's step number 1. Make your call to action one little next step that they can take with you. Step number 2 is that when you talk about what that one little next step they should take is, you need to promise a benefit that they will get for taking it. Ideally, a benefit that they will get really fast. What most podcasters do is say something like, join our community online. And that's it. Or follow us on social. Why? There has to be a benefit, a what's in it for them for doing the next thing that you want them to do. And you have to make that thing clear. The other thing that so many podcasters do is they say, Join our Patreon to support the show. Tell a friend to support the show. Leave a rating and review to support the show. Supporting the show benefits you, not them. That's why they don't do it. Some of them do, but not enough, right? Now I know what you're thinking, but supporting the show does benefit them, because if they don't support the show, it's going to disappear, and then they'll never get to hear my amazing podcast ever again. They don't care. Their life was fine before your podcast existed. That's not a problem that they're going to pay to solve. It's a problem that you're going to pay to solve. And the way that you do that is by making it more beneficial immediately to your listener why they should do that thing. So examples, don't say just join the Facebook group. Say join the Facebook group to get access to other blanks who blank and blank like you. Blanks who blank and blank, what is that? It's how you should be defining your audience. Watch this video to do that. So if you're calling to action your community, describe what the benefit of joining that community is. How's their life going to be better by being in that community? Other examples of benefits from taking a call to action would be, do this so that you can have a say in who we feature on the show. Do XYZ to deepen your understanding of the topic we just covered. Click the link in the show notes to book a time for us to chat and find out if the time is right for me to help you. Right? So we're talking about what's in it for the listener to take the next step. There has to be a very specific benefit, and the quicker they will get the value from that benefit, the better. Number one, there must be one little step. Number two, you must promise a specific benefit for taking that little step. And number three, this is another one that a lot of folks get tripped up on. It should be easy for them to do. You have to understand, people are doing something else when they're listening to podcasts. Their phone is away, it's in their pocket, they're driving, they're at the gym in the squat rack doing who knows what. And so in that moment, when you're asking them to do something, you have to understand they're already doing something else. Do you really think they're going to put the squat bar down, stop what they're doing, pull out their credit card, and sign up for your coaching program right then and there? Do you really think they're going to pull over on the highway, stop what they're doing, and call up a friend and tell them about the podcast? No. You have to make your call to action, the next little step that you're asking them to take, as simple and easy as possible, with as few clicks as possible, or else they're just not going to do it. Remove as many clicks and as many steps in the process as you possibly can. My favorite example of that is, for me, almost every episode of my podcast, Grow the Show, my call to action is to join the free Grow the Show Facebook group, where there's more than almost 2,000 other really high-level podcasters who are helping each other out every single day. And I put a link in the show notes to the Facebook group, but if I were to just put facebook.com/groups/grow the show, the problem is most people who will be clicking on that link in mobile will be brought to a Facebook login page before they even get to the Facebook group. Do you really think people are going to take the time to put in their username and password so that they can join this group? No, they're not. As soon as the login page comes up, they're like, never mind. And they're out, right? You've done this before. You know what that's like. So instead, I use a product called URL Genius, which will actually detect if the listener is on mobile. And if it is, and they have the Facebook app installed, it'll jump them right into the Facebook app, into the Grow the Show Facebook group. One less step, way less friction, way more people actually join my Facebook group. Whatever that number one little step is that you think your podcast listeners should take so that they can further their relationship with you and maybe be monetized in a little bit, whatever that is, you have to make it so easy to do that they would be dumb to not do it. But the more steps the listener has to take in order to do that thing, the more likely they're not going to do it. Lots of options, not going to do it. Lots of steps, not going to do it. Are you seeing now why you're having trouble getting people to do stuff? Also, where you can, you should be asking your listeners to do things that they already know how to do. For example, it's really easy to take a photo on your iPhone, right? You just open up the app, snap the pic. But have you ever tried to get one of your grandparents to take a photo on a smartphone? Really difficult. And guess what? They're not doing it. Why? Even though it's easy, they don't know how. The same thing is going to be true with your podcast listeners. You might be asking them to do something that you know is easy, but if they don't know how to do it, they're not going to do it. So if you're one of those folks that's asking your listeners to donate Bitcoin to your podcast, you better be sure that those people know exactly how to send you Bitcoin, let alone buy it. If for whatever reason, what you're asking your listeners to do, they don't know how to do, you have to explain it like you're explaining it to a third grader. Your listeners are absolutely smart, but in that moment, there's a lot going on and you got to make it as clear and easy to do as you possibly can. That's why it's always better to pick a call to action that there's a really good chance that your target audience knows how to do. So if you have an online community and your target audience is over the age of, I don't know, 30 to 40, it should probably be a Facebook group. If they're younger than that age, you might want to consider Discord. That's also why I, in general, recommend Supercast over Patreon for memberships, because Supercast allows your listeners to subscribe and pay in 2 clicks, whereas with Patreon, they have to learn how to sign up for a Patreon account to begin with, let alone figure out how to become a member. And then to consume your bonus content, they got to remember to go to Patreon and log in there. It's super convoluted. Love Patreon, love the mission, incredible company. Obviously, they've done way more than I ever have, but I do know for a fact that it is easier for listeners to sign up for a Supercast membership than a Patreon membership. All right, so that's it. Those are the 3 steps. You want to make your single call to action one little step. You need to make a promise of the benefit of what that step is. Make it really clear what the listener's going to get for taking that step. And then, of course, you need to make that step really, really, really easy for them to do. Now, if you want a little bit of extra credit, you can add a dash of urgency to the call to action. Find a reason why the listener would want to do it right now. For example, every time I call to action my Facebook group on my podcast feed, I always try to make it clear that if you join the Facebook group right now, you're going to be able to implement what you've learned for next week's episode so that you can stop doing it wrong. And by the next episode you publish, start doing it right. That in their brain makes them like, oh man, yeah, I don't want to publish my next episode wrong. I better get in that Facebook group right away, right? So it's just a little bit of internal urgency that says, hey, here's why you want to do that. And usually it's, so that they can speed up the outcome that you're promising. So that's it. To review, number 1, you want to make your podcast call to action to your listeners at the end of the body of your episode, at the end of the content and before the credits, right at the end. Now that you've heard this, why don't you go ahead and do that? And whatever that is, you want to convey it in a way that it makes it so that it is one little step. So only call to action one thing. You don't have to call to action the same thing every single episode. But the more you call to action that thing, the more likely people will do it. One little thing. Number 2, convey the benefit of taking that action right now. What's in it for them? What are they going to get out of it? They don't care about you. What's in it for them? And then number 3, make it really, really, really easy to do that thing. If you want to hear a call to action like that in action, listen to literally any episode of the Grow the Show podcast. At the end, as soon as we're done teaching the lesson that we're teaching, I immediately say something along the lines of, hey, if you want practice or feedback on what you just learned, join us over the free Grow the Show Facebook group. I will help you totally free. I'll give you feedback. There's 1,000 other podcasters there who will do the same thing, and you can fix it for next episode. And then they click on the link, and it hops them right into the right into the Facebook app, where all they have to do is click join. Super easy, super beneficial for them, super clear. It's the only thing I call to action. I don't call to action joining my coaching program. I don't call to action following me on social or subscribing or telling a friend or all those things. Just this one thing. And my Facebook group has gone from 0 to 2,000 in like 18 months, which is really, and by the way, it's a really, really engaged Facebook group. It's a great 2,000 people. So now it's time for my call to action to you. Comment your call to action on this video, and I will respond back giving you feedback on whether your call to action satisfies the 3 rules. But don't stop with me. If you want some feedback on your call to action from more than me and thousands of other podcasters, you've already heard about the Grow the Show Facebook group. We are there waiting to help you have a better call to action in your next podcast episode. See what I did there? And if this video taught you anything new, be sure to like and subscribe so that I know to make more videos like this. Kevin, you just made like 3 calls to action. What gives? You're not following your own rules. But this isn't a podcast episode. This is a YouTube video. And this YouTube video is over. See you in the next one.